This is Radio Free Cobalt. The Typhoid Epidemic. Typhoid. It's a third world disease. The bacterium is spread through exposure to feces and water. The symptoms include red spots on the skin, fever, headaches, diarrhea, vomiting. In places where there is no treatment, it has a death rate as high as 25%. In the silver mining camp of Cobalt, Ontario, typhoid was a perennial summer problem. It stemmed from the poison waters, the shanty shack homes of the miners, and the predatory policies of both mine owners and the province, who were determined to squeeze every single dime from this mining camp while treating the workers and their families like industrial peasants. In the summer of 1909, the mines of Cobalt were driving an international stock market boom. A brand new streetcar line was opened. The local hockey heroes, the Silver Kings, were creating a new league that would give birth to the Montreal Canadiens. And the vaudeville theaters were packed with audiences every single night. But behind the facade of opulence, the immigrant mining population was living in squalid condition. On a hot July night, a massive fire broke out in Shacktown, the foreign quarter of Cobalt, that left 2,000 people homeless. Italians, Greeks, Syrians, Chinese, Russian Jewish families. They lost everything and were reduced to living in tents. There was no clean water, no place to dispose human waste. And in the heat of a northern summer, typhoid swarmed in the contaminated creeks. By late July, the hospital of local nurse Annie Saunders began filling with typhoid patients. The hospital was soon overcrowded, and a tent was added. And then another tent, and then still another tent. In one 3-day period, 23 new cases of fever were admitted. And then the hospital was dealing with 50 cases, and then 70, then 80, then over 100 cases of typhoid. The nurses were overworked, and they started to get sick. And all around them, people began dying. Bessie Taylor was a working girl. She died from typhoid. She played piano at the Idle Hour Vaudeville Theatre on Swamp Street. She was only 13 years old, and it was said that she had just gotten married 3 weeks before. Miss Mary Evelyn, the only child of Mr. and Mrs. J.J. Doyle, died after returning from boarding school in Toronto. James McGee died in his buggy coming home after trying to nurse his sick son. His daughter, a frontline nurse, was also sick with typhoid. But even as people were dying in disturbing numbers, the town remained focused on peddling the myth of Cobalt as the world's richest mining camp. And for the first month of the outbreak, typhoid was kept off the front page of the newspaper as the journal focused on sporting schemes, mining ventures, and the latest silver discoveries. When health officials began putting up posters warning of the measures needed to contain the outbreak, local politicians went around tearing the posters down. When a rumor spread that Cobalt was about to be quarantined for both typhoid and smallpox, community leaders angrily demanded a retraction from the health inspector. They made it clear they didn't want busybodies scaring off investors with talk of dirty water. The town council turned down an offer of help from the neighboring community of New Liskeard and then publicly attacked a local minister who called on the community to seek outside help. But in reality, this town was very sick from the haphazard expansion that made this the richest silver mining boom in history. At the mines, the managers refused to put in any toilet facilities for their workers. They didn't want them leaving their workplaces. As a result, miners defecated in the tunnels, where the feces mixed with water that spread through the cracks in the rock, and then the miners drank from those streams of water. And these young, healthy workers began to die. Dan McLean, a 24-year-old from Cape Breton, died along with 32-year-old Stanley Johnson, a mine captain from Bisbee, Arizona. 22-year-old Edward Marvin from the Townsite mine died, as did 24-year-old miner David Davis. Alfred Susi died, leaving a wife and 5 children. William Gibson, he had only been in the region for 4 weeks. He died, leaving a wife and 7 children. And with the fever taking its toll on the miners, the productivity of the silver boom was now under serious threat. So the mine owners stepped in and took control of the hospital. They barred women, children, and anyone who wasn't a working miner from getting treatment. For the silver barons, business was business. and typhoid was having a huge impact on mine productivity. Now, the mine owners paid for their share of the hospital board through deductions in the men's wages, and yet at a time of life and death crisis, the families of those very miners were denied hospital care. And this decision to deny access to the hospital to non-miners, women and children, was a key element that furthered the health catastrophe that was unfolding in the community. By mid-September, more than 600 residents were sick. So the town began to fight the epidemic by hiring nurses from across Ontario. They hired 7 and then 25, and then they set out to hire 100 nurses. The nurses who came were appalled by the squalor in Cobalt. One nurse, Miss Phlox, came across a delirious typhoid case in a room where there were 9 people who were all sick, sharing the same floor. One of them was in an advanced stage of tuberculosis. She warned authorities that these people needed to be put in the hospital. Another nurse discovered a young mother with her newborn, both suffering from typhoid, and she wanted them moved to the hospital, but this wasn't allowed. And the women told local media that the situation in Cobalt was, quote, nothing short of manslaughter. But meanwhile, the bickering among the town leaders went on. The town council blamed the local health board. The local health board blamed the Railway Commission. And at the height of the epidemic, the Buffalo and Charlie Angus mines were pumping sewage from the mines right down onto the main street. And the mine owners insisted that if a sewage drain was installed, that the mine should retain the right to blow it up if they felt it interfered in any way with their mine operation. Cobalt was supposed to be a dry town, but the provincial health inspectors were appalled to see the owners of the local saloons washing beer glasses with lake water, despite the fact that the lake was a major source of bacterial infection, as well as being badly polluted from cyanide, arsenic, and other chemicals. Provincial Health Inspector Dr. R.W. Bell threatened the local health board with criminal charges of negligence to force them to ensure that local health codes were being followed. He also threatened to charge local doctors who were working for the mines over their refusal to provide information on contaminated water sources and affected patients. Dr. Bell was forced to take a number of landlords to court over ignoring basic sanitary conditions on their properties. He threatened to evict all the tenants from the Hunter Block and the town square unless the owner addressed the atrocious state of the toilets in his building. Now, Mr. Hunter had also built a number of rental shacks in behind his building, but he had not bothered to supply any toilets for the tenants. So Dr. Bell ordered Hunter to tear down the rental shacks, and Hunter publicly accused the doctor of trying to squeeze money from local businessmen. Dr. Bell was also concerned that families who lived in the shacks on the mine properties were dumping human and household waste into abandoned mine pits because there was no proper municipal infrastructure. There was no access to running water. And people paid outrageous fees for buckets of clean water. So they started finding their own from the surrounding hills. Bell began shutting down the contaminated wells and springs. He condemned 32 wells in the community. One badly polluted spring was the sole source of drinking water for over 600 people. And by mid-October, the number of typhoid victims was well above 800, and yet Bell continued to face resistance from businessmen, politicians, and mine owners. In the end, Bell charged 50 residents for health violations, including prominent businessmen, 2 municipal aldermen, and the chair of the local health board. He ordered the slaughter of 100 pigs that were infected with hog cholera in the slum neighborhood that was known as Pigtown. He established teams to remove and incinerate garbage that had been cluttering the streets for years, and he issued orders against restaurants and mines for dumping waste onto their properties. He issued orders against the Railway Commission that were using Cobalt Station as a waste dump for garbage from the busy trains. Between August and October 1909, there were 840 cases of typhoid in the region that resulted in 67 deaths. What isn't counted in this number is the fact that those with money were able to escape Cobalt and neighboring Haileybury to get treatment in hospitals in southern Ontario. Hospitals like Western, Toronto General, St. Mike's, Grace Hospital were overwhelmed with Cobalt typhoid cases, so much so that a tent was set up for the people at Toronto Western. The local newspaper states that more than 800 people left Cobalt region in attempts to get treatment from hospitals in southern Ontario. So this puts the total number of typhoid cases at about 1,700 people in a 3-month period, which makes the Cobalt typhoid epidemic the worst medical catastrophe of its kind in Ontario history. And yet it happened at a time when cobalt was being promoted around the world as the land of millionaires. The wealth from the silver mines was transforming Toronto from a sleepy backwater into the international mining investment capital of the world. Money from cobalt set Canada on its path to becoming a mining superpower. And yet the multicultural, working class people who made this wealth possible suffered in squalid conditions, forced to live in squatter shacks, without clean water, working in dangerous underground mines. And the epidemic was the inevitable result of what happens when you relentlessly pursue profit over the most basic obligations to human health. Cobalt shows us that one cannot abuse the environment indefinitely. Now here's an interesting postscript. In Cobalt, the townspeople swore they would never again be left without a clean water supply. So they enacted the Cobalt Water Act to protect the one set of clean lakes from any future development. In 2018, the province of Ontario gave a mining license to a company to explore on this watershed, and it resulted in a huge outcry. And provincial officials were shocked. They said they never heard of the Cobalt Water Act. This is because the act predates any environmental water policies in Ontario. And the people of Cobalt made sure that that mining project did not go ahead, even though they badly needed the economic development. And this is because the people of Cobalt have never forgotten the stories of the horrific epidemic that hit the region in the summer of 1909.